The law says stop. Trump says no. A deadline written into law, a war that has already blown past it, and a president who says the law simply does not apply to him. That is where the United States stands today, not just in a military conflict with Iran, but in a constitutional standoff that strikes at the very foundation of American democracy. The question is no longer only about missiles and blockades. It is about who, in America, has the power to send young men and women to war and to keep them there. On February 28, 2026, American and Israeli warplanes launched a series of coordinated strikes against Iran. The targets were military installations, government buildings, and nuclear infrastructure. Within hours, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was dead, killed in one of the most audacious surprise attacks in modern warfare. Iran retaliated with hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones aimed at Israel, at American military bases across the Gulf, and at civilian infrastructure in allied Arab states. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which nearly 20% of the world's oil supply passes, was effectively closed. The world had not seen a conflict of this scale in the Middle East since the Gulf War of 1999.
The operation was given a name, Operation Epic Fury. And for the first days, the Trump administration presented it as a swift, decisive campaign. No boots on the ground, a targeted strike to eliminate Iran's nuclear threat once and for all. Clean, surgical, over quickly. That was 62 days ago. The 1973 War Powers Resolution was born out of a wound, the wound of Vietnam, a war that Congress had never formally declared, but that consumed 58,000 American lives over 2 decades. Lawmakers at the time made a promise to the American people. Never again would a president drag the nation into an open-ended war without the consent of the people's representatives. The law they wrote was blunt and specific. A president could deploy military force in emergencies without congressional approval, but only for 60 days. After that, either Congress authorizes the war or the troops come home. May 1st, 2026, day 62 of Operation Epic Fury. The clock has run out. But here is what makes this moment unlike anything in recent American political history. The Trump administration is not asking for an extension. It is not going to Congress with a war authorization request. Instead, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth appeared before the House Armed Services Committee and delivered a statement that left many lawmakers visibly stunned. He argued that the current ceasefire, a fragile, undeclared pause in hostilities that has been in place since April 7, effectively suspends the 60-day count. The war, in his telling, is on pause. Therefore, the clock is on pause. Therefore, the War Powers Resolution does not apply. Not everyone in Washington agrees, not even close.
Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, one of the most vocal critics of executive overreach on war powers, told reporters outside the Senate chamber that Hegseth's argument was, in his words, legally incoherent. Kaine pointed out that the ceasefire has no formal treaty, no signed agreement, and no enforcement mechanism. American warships are still blockading Iranian ports. The USS Charlotte, a nuclear-powered submarine, sank the Iranian frigate Iris Dina in the Indian Ocean just weeks ago. Oil tankers are still being turned back from the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian drones are still flying over Lebanon. If this is a ceasefire, critics argue, then the word has lost all meaning. And yet, the Senate has now voted multiple times on measures that would compel the Trump administration to end the conflict, and each time those measures have failed. In the House, a War Powers Resolution came within a single vote of passing. One vote. The margin between the constitutional question being forced into the open and being quietly buried. Here is something that does not get reported enough. There are Republicans in Congress who privately agree that the administration has overstepped. Several senior GOP senators have told reporters, on condition of anonymity, that they are deeply uncomfortable with the precedent being set. But political loyalty and fear of being seen as undermining troops in the field has kept them silent. This is how constitutional guardrails erode. Not with a dramatic confrontation, but with silence from people who know better. The financial dimension of this standoff makes it even more combustible. Acting Pentagon Controller Jules Hurst III testified before Congress that Operation Epic Fury has cost the United States approximately $25 billion in its first 8 weeks. That figure, Hurst acknowledged, is primarily driven by munitions, the guided bombs, cruise missiles, and interceptor rockets, consumed at a rate the American defense industrial base has never before sustained in peacetime, or in what the administration insists on calling not quite wartime. But here is the figure that is not in the official testimony. According to multiple U.S. officials who spoke to CBS News, the real cost is closer to $50 billion, nearly double the public estimate. The gap is explained largely by weapons that have been fired and must now be replaced. by damage to American military bases in the Gulf that the Pentagon has not publicly acknowledged, and by the long-term cost of repositioning naval assets. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group has been operating continuously in the Arabian Sea for over 2 months. Every day at sea is a day of fuel, maintenance, and wear that will eventually need to be paid for. Meanwhile, the American taxpayer is feeling the war in a more immediate way. The average price of a gallon of gasoline in the United States hit $4.39 on May 1, 2026, up 34 cents from just 1 month ago, according to AAA. That is not an abstraction. That is a family deciding whether to fill the tank or buy groceries. It is a truck driver calculating whether the job still pays. It is an economy beginning to buckle under the weight of a conflict that was supposed to be over quickly.
This is not the first time an American president has tested the limits of the War Powers Resolution. Richard Nixon vetoed the original bill in 1973, calling it unconstitutional. Ronald Reagan sent troops to Lebanon without authorization. Bill Clinton conducted a 78-day air campaign over Kosovo without a formal declaration of war. Barack Obama cited the resolution, but argued that the bombing campaign in Libya did not constitute hostilities under the law's definition. Every administration since 1973 has found creative ways to argue that the resolution does not quite apply to whatever they happen to be doing. But legal scholars who study this history say the Trump administration's position in May 2026 is something qualitatively different. Georgetown University law professor Rosa Brooks, writing in The Atlantic, argued that calling an active naval blockade and an ongoing aerial surveillance campaign over Iran a ceasefire is not a legal argument. It is a rhetorical sleight of hand. The founders gave Congress the power to declare war, Brooks wrote, precisely because they feared what history had always shown, that executives, once given the tools of war, are reluctant to put them down. Reuters, in a detailed investigation published on April 28, reported that internal White House legal counsel memos have acknowledged the constitutional risk, but concluded that the political cost of going to Congress, where authorization might fail, outweighs the legal risk of proceeding without it. In other words, the administration knows it may be on shaky legal ground. It has decided to proceed anyway. And then there is the geopolitical dimension that no one in Washington wants to say out loud. If Congress were to force an end to Operation Epic Fury, if lawmakers actually exercise the authority the War Powers Resolution gives them, what happens next? Does Iran interpret the withdrawal as weakness and resume its nuclear program? Does Israel act unilaterally, launching its own strikes without American support? Does the Strait of Hormuz remain closed indefinitely, sending oil prices past $150 a barrel and triggering the recession that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has already warned about? These are not hypothetical questions. They are the calculations that are playing out in real time, behind closed doors, in the Senate cloakroom, in the Situation Room, in the foreign ministries of every major power on Earth. Russian President Vladimir Putin, in a phone call with Trump reported by AFP on April 29, urged the American president not to restart strikes on Iran, a remarkable moment in which the leader of a country currently at war with Ukraine found time to insert himself into America's Persian Gulf standoff. China has watched the entire episode with the studied silence of a nation that is filing away every lesson about American resolve, American constitutional friction, and American political dysfunction for future reference. Pakistan, quietly serving as the back-channel mediator between Washington and Tehran, has relayed at least 3 rounds of proposals between the two sides. So far, according to NPR, only one formal round of talks has taken place. The core sticking points remain unchanged: Iran's nuclear enrichment program, the fate of its existing uranium stockpile, the American blockade, and the release of $20 billion in frozen Iranian assets. Neither side has moved significantly. The ceasefire is not a peace. It is a pause between two parties who do not trust each other at all, and for good reason. Iran's President Pezeshkian said it plainly in a phone call with Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. The United States attacked Iran twice while negotiations were underway. Trust, he said, has been completely destroyed. So where does this leave the War Powers Resolution and the principle it was designed to protect? The honest answer is, in a more precarious position than at any point since 1973. If the Trump administration successfully argues that a naval blockade plus a fragile ceasefire does not trigger the resolution's requirements, then future presidents will have a roadmap. Deploy forces, strike hard, declare a pause, call it a ceasefire, repeat indefinitely. The 60-day clock becomes a suggestion, not a constraint. Some constitutional scholars argue this outcome was always inevitable, that the War Powers Resolution was a political document masquerading as a legal one, and that no president was ever truly going to be constrained by it. Others argue that this moment, precisely because it is so visible and so consequential, represents the last real opportunity for Congress to reassert its constitutional authority over the decision to go to war. The founders of the American Republic debated this question at length, Alexander Hamilton argued for executive flexibility in times of crisis. James Madison argued, repeatedly, passionately, at length, that concentrating war powers in a single executive was the most dangerous thing a republic could do. Of all the enemies to public liberty, Madison wrote, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. 237 years later, that debate is no longer theoretical. It is playing out in real time, measured in billions of dollars, barrels of oil, and the lives of soldiers and civilians on multiple continents. Who controls America's war machine? The answer to that question, the real answer, not the legal one, will define the shape of American power for a generation.
The missiles have stopped. For now, the blockade continues. The negotiations inch forward. And in Washington, the fight over who has the authority to end all of it, or to resume it, is just beginning. So here is the question worth sitting with. If a democracy's own laws cannot stop a war once it has started, what exactly does that democracy stand for? And if Congress cannot find the will to answer that question now, with fizzy billion-dollars spent, gas at $4.39 a gallon, and a ceasefire that could collapse at any moment, when will it ever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This is a conversation that should not be happening only in Washington.